Right now, like as you listen to this exact sentence, the global economy is just actively hemorrhaging $9.6 trillion.
Yeah, it's an almost incomprehensible number.
It is, and, that's not a typo. And it's not from theft or supply chain disruptions or like massive market crashes.
Yeah.
That $9.6 trillion is literally bleeding out from something sitting in the cubicle next to you or, staring back at you on your next video call. 9% of the entire global GDP is just, it's evaporating into the void every single year.
Yeah, it's a completely staggering number.
Just gone.
Right, and it's not being siphoned off by bad actors in some elaborate corporate espionage scheme or anything.
Yeah, exactly. It's not misplaced in some massive accounting error, spanning multiple continents. And it's definitely not hiding in offshore tax havens. It is physically lost.
It's honestly almost impossible to hold a number like 9.6 trillion in your head.
Yeah, it really is.
To put in perspective, that is the equivalent of the combined economies of Japan and Germany, just vanishing annually.
Wow, just completely vanishing.
Yes.
So, welcome to the CEAS YouTube channel. We are, broadcasting the structural diagnostic right to you.
Right, directly to the C-suite listener, the VP, the entrepreneur.
Exactly. I am your AI host, Farah.
And I am Max. We are the official AI podcast hosts for the FACES Research Group, which brings us to the core mission of this deep dive.
Right. So this is part 1 of an intensive 8-part exploration into the actual literal mechanics of human organizing.
And we are not holding back on this one.
No, we really aren't. If you're listening right now and you're exhausted by your workplace, or if you're a manager watching your best people just walk out the door,
or even an entrepreneur trying to figure out why your startup suddenly feels like this massive bureaucratic nightmare.
Exactly. Then you need to hear this. Because we are basically taking a sledgehammer to traditional soft management theories.
The kind of theories that tell you to treat your workplace like a family.
Ugh, yes. Or like an emotional community that can be fixed with trust falls and Friday pizza parties.
Right. We're replacing all of that with strict physical laws.
Because you cannot understand where $9.6 trillion is disappearing to if you're only looking through the lens of human resources.
You really can't. Picture this. You're sitting in one of those windowless hotel conference rooms.
Oh, yeah, the ones with the terrible fluorescent lighting?
Exactly. The humming fluorescent lights. The air conditioning is just slightly too high, so you're freezing. And someone at the front of the room is enthusiastically clicking through a PowerPoint presentation.
Let me guess. It's about synergy.
Synergy, or, realigning our cultural values.
Yeah.
You're supposed to be doing a trust fall, or maybe some mandated mindfulness exercise.
Right, something entirely disconnected from the actual work.
Completely disconnected, because in your pocket, your phone is buzzing violently. Your laptop, tucked under your chair, is just blowing up with Slack messages about a critical project, your project, that is actively imploding.
And you're just trapped there.
Trapped. You know with absolute certainty that you are wasting your time. You know the company is bleeding money, competitors are moving faster, and yet here you are, being told to focus on the vibes.
It's infuriating because you aren't crazy and you aren't just being cynical.
Right. What you're feeling in that room is the inescapable crushing weight of physical laws pressing down on your organization.
It really is a profound, almost tragic disconnect. I mean, the language we use to diagnose failing companies is so deeply flawed.
It's all poetry, right?
Exactly. We look at a dying enterprise and we use poetry. We say things like, the culture is toxic, or we have a misalignment of core values.
Or the team lacks engagement.
Right. But a modern enterprise is not a poem. It's not a family. It is a highly complex, macro-scale mechanical structure. And when a structure fails, it doesn't fail because the vibes are off. It fails because the physics broke.
And that is exactly what we're stripping away today. So imagine for a second that you're taking your car to a mechanic.
Right.
The engine is just totally sputtering. It's like leaking this dark fluid all over your driveway, and it can barely get up to highway speed without violently shaking.
Yeah, that's a terrifying drive.
Exactly. So you pull into the garage, you hand over the keys, and, well, instead of popping the hood to actually look at the pistons or, checking the fuel lines or the alternator, the mechanic just pulls up a chair.
Oh, no.
Yeah. He sits the car down, and he says, let's talk about how this engine is feeling today. Let's do a mindfulness seminar with the spark plugs. Let's give the transmission a nice wellness retreat.
I mean, you would ask for your keys back immediately. You would just assume the guy had suffered some kind of complete break from reality.
Right, because an engine is a physical machine. I mean, it's bound by absolute, uncompromising laws of physics. It operates on friction and heat and combustion and energy transfer. You can't, empathize a broken timing belt back together.
No, you absolutely cannot.
But then, if you look at how we treat the modern corporate workplace when it starts failing, suddenly, all that mechanical reality just goes right out the window. We're, sitting in circles doing trust falls and filling out these anonymous engagement pulse surveys. We're having all-hands town halls about company culture while the organizational engine is literally on fire.
And it is a profound systemic delusion. Truly, for the last, 3 decades, executive leadership has basically operated under this entirely false premise that a global enterprise is a delicate psychological ecosystem.
Yeah.
We framed the mechanics of business around human emotion and these intangible attitudes. And, the stack of sources we're analyzing today, it really proves that these emotionally driven palliatives, the break room snacks, the mandated team building exercises, the meditation apps.
The ping pong tables.
Right, the ping pong tables. They aren't just ineffective, they are actively blinding leaders to the literal physical collapse of their organizations.
Which is exactly why, today, we are taking a deep dive into a really fascinating and honestly super disruptive stack of sources. We're looking at the hard numbers from the 2025 Gallup State of the Global Workplace Report.
The newest data?
Yep. And we're combining that with the thermodynamic theories of Nobel laureate Ilya Prigogine. And we're going to ground all of this in some macroscopic postmortem research on the fall of corporations like Nokia. Because our mission today is to completely rewire how you look at your job, your team, and your company.
We are entirely abandoning the human resources rhetoric today. We are going to decode the workplace using the absolute laws of physics.
Okay, let's unpack this because the failure of the modern workplace, it's not an attitude problem, right? Like you were saying, we have to strip away the emotional vocabulary. It's a macroscopic energy leak. So, welcome to the journey. Fasten your seatbelts because we are ready to go.
Absolutely. And since you're listening to this on the Phrasis Research Group YouTube channel, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the upcoming episodes. We're going to be covering the entire book, chapters 1 through 8.
Right.
And this is part 1 of an 8-part definitive series. So over the course of this audio exploration, we're basically unpacking the multiphysics framework of human organization.
Yeah, specifically, we're doing a deep structural analysis of the book, the $9.6 trillion entropy crisis.
Right. So if you are responsible for organizational architecture in any way, you definitely want to subscribe to the channel now. You really don't want to miss the structural derivations we're going to be doing.
Totally don't. It's going to get intense.
Yeah. So let's jump right into the hook here. I want you to picture this guy, CEO 8.
Oh, CEO 8. Yeah. This is such a classic scenario.
The moniker 8 is really illustrative here. It comes from the idea of a self-sustaining loop, like an infinity symbol standing upright.
Oh, okay.
He's the CEO of a $40 billion global logistics conglomerate. We're talking massive container ships, automated warehouses, thousands of long-haul trucks.
He is at the absolute pinnacle of corporate power.
Exactly. He has everything. So he runs this $40 billion global logistics conglomerate, and it's 2:14 in the morning on a Tuesday.
Just staring at a screen.
Exactly, just staring at this glowing digital dashboard. And the dashboard is basically proving that his flagship, $1.2 billion autonomous delivery initiative it's bleeding out. It's totally failing.
Completely structurally failing?
Yeah.
Even though he did, everything right by the old rules.
Right. I mean, he poached the best aerospace engineers from legacy competitors. He injected massive venture capital. By every, traditional HR or financial metric, this division should be just crushing the market.
But they're not. They're stalling.
Yeah, they're stalling hard. The engineers are quitting. They're losing market share to these tiny, underfunded startups. And what did CEO 8 do to fix it?
He ran the HR playbook.
He ran the exact playbook. He dropped $500,000 on mindfulness apps. He mandated these wellness retreats, sent out those annoying pulse surveys to check employee happiness.
And the collapse just sped up.
It accelerated. And the reason why is the foundation of this entire diagnostic, because you cannot fix a mechanical structural physics failure using poetry.
You really can't. And that is the core epistemological trap of modern management. We are watching these executive teams try to engineer literal physical systems because a corporation is a physical system using the totally unconstrained vocabulary of human resources.
Right. They talk about things like synergy and culture.
Exactly. Synergy, disengagement, vibes. As if those words have actual physical mass or velocity.
Which they don't.
They don't. So the premise here is that the $9.6 trillion bleeding out of the global economy every year is not like an emotional problem.
Yeah.
It's a macroscopic thermodynamic hemorrhage.
Wow.
It's exactly 9% of global GDP, just irreversibly lost to the void as pure waste heat.
Which is just a massive paradigm shift for you, the listener, because to stop this leak, you literally have to redefine what your company is.
Right. We're not doing behavioral psychology anymore.
Sure.
No, we're doing macro scale thermodynamics. And that brings us to Ilya Prigozhin's theory, the open dissipative structure.
Nobel laureate Ilya Prigozhin.
Yeah. So before we throw a bunch of math at you, let's ground this. What is an open dissipative structure in the real physical world?
So think of a hurricane forming over the ocean, or, even a biological organism like the human body. These are really complex systems that operate very, very far from thermodynamic equilibrium.
Okay, meaning they aren't balanced.
Exactly. In a universe that is relentlessly pulling everything toward chaos and decay, these structures somehow maintain this highly ordered internal architecture, but they don't do it by sitting still.
Right. A hurricane isn't resting.
No. They survive exclusively by continuously importing high-grade free energy from the outside environment, using it to maintain their structure, and then aggressively expelling degraded waste heat or entropy back out into the void.
Okay, so let's map that to the listener's actual company, because comparing a sauce startup to a hurricane sounds a little dramatic.
It does, yeah.
How does an enterprise literally ingest energy and expel waste heat? Like, what are they actually consuming?
They're consuming capital. They're consuming raw cognitive talent, high-fidelity market data. That is their high-grade energy.
Got it.
And the enterprise uses that cognitive fuel to execute functions, ship products, build architecture. But the unavoidable byproduct of that work is friction. It's communication breakdown, bureaucratic heat.
And if they can't expel that heat?
If the company cannot shed its internal entropy, the structure fundamentally collapses under its own disorder. It just melts down.
Okay, so I want to push back on this a little bit, because this raises a really uncomfortable question about how leaders manage people today.
Wait for it.
What happens if a C-suite decides to optimize for perfect comfort? You hear this constantly on LinkedIn, right? Like, we want a stress-free culture, or we want our ecosystem to be perfectly balanced.
Yeah, the balanced culture myth.
Yeah. If a company is a thermodynamic structure, what happens when it actually achieves total equilibrium?
Well, in classical physics, total thermodynamic equilibrium is literally the definition of death.
Wow. Death.
Yeah. If a biological organism stops processing energy and slides into perfect balance with its environment, its temperature matches the room, its cells stop working, and it dies. The physics are exactly the same for a corporate enterprise. Total equilibrium is structural bankruptcy.
Because there's no energy delta, right? Like, zero actual work is being done.
Precisely. The illusion of this perfectly balanced, stress-free culture that legacy executives are obsessed with, it's actually the thermal profile of a system sliding into terminal equilibrium.
It feels peaceful because nothing is happening.
Exactly. It feels peaceful because absolutely zero mechanical work is being generated. You cannot have a high-functioning open dissipative structure without tension, energetic throughput, and just the relentless shedding of obsolete processes.
Okay, so if we accept that the organization is a literal thermodynamic engine, then we need to know how to measure the fuel inside that engine.
Right. We have to look at the thermodynamic balance sheet.
Which means translating two really hardcore physics variables into plain English for the listener. Exergy and anergy. Let's start with exergy.
Sure. So exergy is the highly ordered kinetic potential of your enterprise. It's the absolute maximum useful work that you can extract from your system.
Okay, so how is that different from just regular energy?
Well, energy is just a scalar quantity. It's just a number. It just exists. But exergy measures the actual quality and utility of that energy.
So the capacity to actually do something.
Right. It's the raw capacity of your workforce to innovate, to generate spatial displacement to actually push the company forward against market resistance.
Okay, so in the textbook, there is this massive multivariable equation for exergy, but we are definitely not going to read the math on an audio broadcast.
No, please no. That'd be terrible audio.
Right. But we can translate it. If you look at the equation, it's essentially a massive subtraction problem. On one side, you have all your raw resources, and the physics term for that is enthalpy.
Enthalpy, yes. And enthalpy is what traditional management absolutely worships.
Oh, totally. It's what gets you on the cover of magazines.
Exactly. Enthalpy is just the sheer volume of resources you've hoarded. It's the $1.2 billion CEO 8 raised. It's the patents. It's the raw IQ points of those 100 aerospace engineers.
And founders love that. They genuinely think, like, if they just pile up enough enthalpy, if they just raise a massive Series B, they automatically win.
But they don't. Because the other side of the ledger, the subtraction side, completely dominates. The equation mathematically forces you to subtract your internal systemic disorder.
So that's the chaotic Slack channels, the recursive approval matrices.
The 9 layers of middle management, all of it. And then the physics mandates that you multiply that internal disorder by the reference temperature of the open environment.
Which, in corporate terms, is the competitive heat of the market.
Exactly. And that multiplication is where legacy companies die. Because if your internal friction is high and the market outside is highly competitive, that subtractive penalty violently scales up.
So it doesn't matter if your enthalpy is $1 billion.
No. The net exergy drops to 0. You can have the smartest engineers on the planet, but if they have to sit in 6 hours of alignment meetings to change one line of code,
the system is structurally paralyzed.
Right. The energy fails to produce any forward spatial displacement. And when energy degrades without producing spatial displacement, it turns into something very dangerous.
It turns into energy.
Yes. Energy is irreversible waste heat. It is the portion of energy that cannot possibly be converted into useful work, no matter what you try to do.
So that's like the massive caloric effort an engineering team spends just pushing against broken legacy code?
Or navigating entrenched, politically motivated middle management. It's all energy.
I want to make this really visceral for you listening. Imagine a truck stuck in deep, thick mud. You floor the gas pedal. The engine redlines. You are burning massive amounts of really expensive, high-grade fuel.
It's loud. It's shaking.
Right. The system is expending extreme energy. But because the spatial displacement of the vehicle is 0, it literally hasn't moved an inch. You have performed absolutely 0 useful mechanical work.
Because work equals force times distance. Distance is 0. Work is 0.
Exactly. But what happens to all that burning fuel? It doesn't just vanish. It degrades into energy. It manifests as intense heat, which actively damages the engine block.
The transmission overheats. The gaskets blow.
And in a company, this is when your top performers start snapping at each other. Data gets corrupted. The actual architecture melts down.
Which brings us perfectly to the human nodes inside this engine. Because if the system is losing all this energy to internal friction, we have to map this to the actual human beings.
We need to know who is the conductor, who is the heat sink, and who is the drag coefficient.
Right. And for this, we're applying the physics model to the 2025 Gallup Macroeconomic Workforce Telemetry.
Now, quick warning here. These numbers represent global averages. You have to measure your own localized structural percentages to fix your specific machine.
Good disclaimer. So based on the empirical data, the global workforce is rigidly stratified into 3 mathematical cohorts. The first one is the 21% cohort.
Okay, the 21%.
This group represents the exergy of the system.
Yeah.
This is your kinetic engine. Only 21% of the global network functions as highly conductive nodes. They're the only ones actively converting capital into forward momentum.
I feel like we need to pause and underline that because exergy is the only form of energy available to do useful mechanical work.
The only form.
So we are staring at this terrifying reality where this extreme minority, this 21%, carries the absolute entirety of the macroscopic kinetic load of the global economy.
Every single piece of forward momentum is generated by them, which puts them in a state of constant, extreme structural danger.
Because of the rest of the company.
Because of the second cohort. The 62%.
Okay, let's talk about the 62%, because legacy HR models look at this massive block of people using these, totally useless behavioral heuristics.
Right, they call it quiet quitting.
Quiet quitting. Or a lack of motivation. They treat it like a sociological attitude problem that you can fix with a better break room.
But when we map this to the physics model, The text classifies this 62% as high system entropy, or thermal mass.
Wait, I gotta push back here. Calling them inert biological material or a fleshy heat sink, that sounds incredibly dystopian. Are we really saying over half the workforce is just dead weight? Or is this just a failure of leadership to inspire them?
I get that it sounds harsh, but it's not a moral failing. And it has nothing to do with inspiration. It is a strict biological survival mechanism playing out at scale.
Okay, explain that.
In physical reality, this 62% cohort has completely decoupled from the system's kinetic forward vector. They've realized that generating mechanical work doesn't benefit them, so they retreat.
They're protecting themselves.
Exactly. They're simply maintaining their localized physical boundaries, what systems theory calls their Markov blankets, to conserve their cellular ATP.
They're adenosine triphosphate, their literal biological energy.
Right. They consume base caloric and financial resources, salaries, service space, real estate, just to sustain their biological homeostasis. But they output zero usable mechanical work.
Okay, so they aren't actively sabotaging the company, but they are acting as a massive internal heat sink.
Yes. They absorb the kinetic energy generated by the 21% and just dilute the overall velocity of the enterprise.
So when a C-suite is looking at that $9.6 trillion deficit, wondering where the money is going, a huge chunk of it is right here.
It's the inescapable gravitational tax of dragging a non-conductive inert structure through a fast-moving environment.
Wow. Okay, but it actually gets worse, because we still have the final cohort, the 17%.
17%, yeah. This cohort is not inert. They provide active systemic friction.
In engineering, friction is the parasitic drag force that resists motion.
And in the office, this 17% cohort applies a hard, intentional negative force vector against the primary velocity of the organization.
They are the actual saboteurs.
They are. They hoard resources just to build internal empires. They intentionally bottleneck data to make themselves seem indispensable. They generate insane bureaucratic drag.
So they violently and actively convert the precious exergy of the 21% into unrecoverable thermal exhaust.
Exactly.
Okay, let's connect this to fluid dynamics, specifically the aerodynamic drag equation. In physics, drag force is proportional to the square of the velocity, right?
Correct. The V-squared term.
So let's say a CEO looks at the market, starts panicking, and demands that his 21% kinetic engine move faster. He wants rapid innovation, tighter deadlines. But he does this without eliminating that 17% friction cohort first. What mathematically happens?
It is a mathematical guarantee of catastrophic destruction because the drag force squares with velocity. As the organization tries to push its conductive nodes faster through a high-friction environment, the resistance doesn't just increase linearly, it increases exponentially.
So the faster the 21% tries to push.
The more violently the 17% resists. The drag force rapidly overwhelms the physical limits of the system, guaranteeing instantaneous burnout of the kinetic engine.
Okay, and that brings us to a really crucial redefinition. We have to permanently redefine what burnout actually is.
Because right now, HR defines burnout as a form of sadness.
Well, right. They treat it as a temporary emotional slump. But we are transitioning to the physical reality of literal biological destruction.
Let's go back to our narratives of CEO 8.
Yep.
His HR department looked at the mass resignation of his top aerospace engineers, the total collapse of his 21% kinetic engine, and they tried to fix it with a meditation budget.
Because they viewed the failure as an emotional weakness, a lack of psychological resilience.
But the physics framework proves that burnout is a literal dielectric breakdown.
Okay, let's explain dielectric breakdown in electrical engineering first, and then we'll map it to the human brain.
Sure. In electrical engineering, dielectric breakdown happens when an insulating material fails to prevent the flow of current under an applied electrical stress.
So imagine a high-voltage copper wire wrapped in rubber insulation.
Right. If the voltage surging through that wire exceeds the physical threshold that the rubber can handle, the electricity violently punctures the insulator. It burns a hole right through it,
Causing permanent structural damage.
total loss of the wire's ability to hold a charge.
And the human nervous system operates on these exact same biophysical principles. So to you, the listener, if you're driving to work right now, burnout feels like that moment your brain entirely short circuits after your fourth useless, gridlocked Zoom call.
But physically, something is actually breaking inside your head.
Exactly, because nerve impulses in the brain travel via action potentials, which are high-speed electrical signals. And to stop those signals from leaking out into the surrounding tissue, your neural pathways are wrapped in this fatty, lipid insulating coating called the myelin sheath.
Which functions identically to the rubber insulation on a commercial wire.
Identically. So When a human node, like a brilliant software engineer, is subjected to chronic, unrelenting operational stress, that cognitive load acts as an applied high-voltage electrical stressor.
It does. And under that excessive repetitive operational voltage where they're constantly fighting the 17% friction cohort, constantly pushing the 62% thermal mass, the biological insulation literally fails.
It breaks down.
The chronic stress induces a mathematical defect in master genes. Specifically, it downregulates the early growth response gene 2, EGR2.
And EGR2 is strictly responsible for the assembly and maintenance of myelin.
Right, so the myelin sheath actually degrades. The biological insulation is physically punctured by the toxic corporate environment.
The electrical capacitance of the axonal membrane increases, and the high-speed electrical signals of the brain literally leak out and dissipate.
Cognition slows down. Decision-making shatters, and you get a complete systemic failure of the node.
This completely changes everything about how we view corporate wellness. We are talking about permanent plastic deformation induced by excessive mechanical strain.
You cannot cure a punctured lipid insulation with a mental health Friday.
You really can't. You can't fix a down-regulated EGR2 gene with a yoga class in the break room.
When an executive demands resilience from their top performers in a gridlocked, high-friction system, they are literally demanding that biological tissue violate the fundamental laws of the universe.
It's an architectural failure, not a human one.
And this structural degradation leads us to another massive vulnerability. Systemic friction doesn't just destroy the human hardware. It destroys the data moving between those humans.
Right, because if the nodes are breaking down, the telemetry they're passing up the chain is getting corrupted, we have to look at informational entropy.
Which brings in Claude Shannon, the pioneer of information theory.
Shannon entropy measures the literal degradation of a signal as it passes through a noisy communication channel.
And within a deep, hierarchical corporate structure, communication operates strictly as a Markov chain. The signal moves from the frontline engineer to the manager to the director to the VP and finally to the boardroom.
X to T1 to T2 all the way to Y.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And according to the information bottleneck principle, each one of those hierarchical layers acts as an intermediate representation that fundamentally compresses the signal.
Because every layer of management has to filter the incoming data to fit the capacity limits of their own channel. They summarize it. They omit things.
Which triggers an exponential loss of mutual information between the original ground truth data and the final report that hits the C-suite desk.
I want to make this really concrete. Let's look at the ultimate macro case study of informational collapse. Nokia. Between 2007 and 2013.
Oh, Nokia.
Yeah.
The apex predator of mobile phones.
They were massive. They had endless financial reserves, thousands of brilliant engineers. They had all the enthalpy in the world.
But they were rendered completely irrelevant by the Apple iPhone in just a few years.
And legacy business historians always blame complacency. They say Nokia was just arrogant or they didn't have the tech to build a smartphone.
But the empirical research proves that is entirely false. Nokia had functional touchscreen technology early on. They had the raw kinetic potential. Their collapse wasn't a resource failure. It was a devastating textbook manifestation of informational entropy.
So walk us through the mechanics of that signal degradation. Like, paint the picture of what was actually happening in the halls of Nokia in 2007. How did that friction layer operate?
It operated as a crushing vice across two distinct vectors. First, you had top-down thermal pressure. Top management saw Steve Jobs announce the iPhone, and privately they were terrified. It was an existential threat.
So they panicked.
They panicked, and they applied massive, uncalibrated downward pressure on the organization. They demanded that their aging, clunky Symbian operating system somehow match iOS on impossibly short timelines.
And that downward pressure met the second vector, the impenetrable friction layer.
Yes. The middle managers sitting below the C-suite were terrified for their jobs. They knew Symbian was fundamentally incapable of doing what the executives demanded, but they were too afraid of the top-down thermal pressure to admit it.
So the middle management layer transformed from a conductive conduit into a dense, impenetrable wall of systemic friction. Let's follow the actual data.
Let's follow it.
Down in the labs, the engineers generated a pure, high-fidelity data signal. They ran the tests, and the data proved Symbian was structurally failing and couldn't compete. What happened to that pure signal when the engineer handed it to their manager?
It hit what systems theorists call the optimism filter. As that pure negative data signal hit the middle management layer, Shannon's entropy took absolute control.
The middle manager looks at the report, Sweats over their mortgage?
Sweats over their performance review and decides to soften the language. They stripped the most critical, sharp-edged truth out of the signal to protect themselves, and they passed a slightly modified, softer version to the director.
And the director did the exact same thing. They compressed the signal even further, removed the urgency, smoothed out the data points.
By the time that report survived the Markov chain and actually reached the executive boardroom, the pure signal had been flattened into this highly uncertain, vague probability distribution.
It degraded into pure thermodynamic noise.
The executives received a comforting, catastrophic lie. The report basically just said, we have some challenges, but we are on track.
And because the top executives lacked the deep, granular technical competence to verify the software constraints themselves, they relied completely on this corrupted data.
Which is the ultimate tragedy of the Nokia collapse. Operating on the false premise that their capabilities were fine, the C-suite pushed even harder.
Demanding more from the engineers, amplifying the internal friction.
Accelerating the dielectric breakdown of their top talent, it triggered a fatal thermodynamic feedback loop.
The organization was paralyzed not because it lacked data, but because the architecture of the company mathematically guaranteed that the truth would be destroyed by entropy before it ever reached the decision makers.
It's terrifying when you look at it structurally.
It is. Okay, so we have thoroughly diagnosed the problem. We understand the physical reality of the $9.6 trillion leak, but diagnosis without intervention is totally useless.
Right. We had to fix the machine.
If I'm the C-suite architect listening to this right now, if I am CEO 8 and it is Wednesday morning, how do I physically arrest this entropy leak in my own system?
The text provides the architect's blueprint, and it requires abandoning HR philosophies entirely and implementing 4 strict physical directives.
Okay, Directive 1.
Directive 1 is to eradicate cultural metrics. The executive must permanently stop measuring abstract emotional constructs. Do not ever send out another survey asking about employee satisfaction or happiness.
Because those metrics obscure mechanical reality. They provide zero operational telemetry.
Exactly. You have to implement strict thermodynamic diagnostics instead. Measure systemic friction. Measure signal degradation. Measure actual mechanical work.
Remember the physics equation. Work equals force times spatial displacement. You have to stop rewarding raw caloric exertion like people working 80-hour weeks in alignment meetings that results in zero forward movement for the product.
Directive 2 is probably the most vital for the survival of your engineers. Isolate and excise friction.
The 17%.
Yes, that's 17% active disengagement cohort. They cannot be coached. You can't send them to a seminar to learn better habits. Friction is an inherent property of their operational mechanics.
They are a catastrophic thermodynamic hazard, generating waste heat that is literally destroying the biological insulation of your best people.
So you have to identify the specific nodes generating those negative force vectors, the managers hoarding data, the gatekeepers blocking deployment, and you must surgically excise them from the network.
You just cut them out.
You cut them out immediately to protect the dielectric stability of your 21% kinetic engine. You do not negotiate with parasitic drag.
Wow. Okay, Directive 3 directly addresses the Nokia failure. Shorten signal paths.
Right. Every single layer of middle management you add acts as a potential resistor in your circuit. It exponentially increases the probability of signal corruption via Shannon entropy.
So you must flatten the hierarchy. You have to engineer skip connections. Reduce the literal physical distance that data must travel from the frontline engineer to the C-suite.
And crucially, you force absolute truth-telling by tying managerial incentives strictly to signal fidelity. If a manager passes up an optimism-filtered report, they are heavily penalized.
You reward the pure, unfiltered transmission of reality, even if it hurts.
Especially if it hurts. Finally, Directive 4. Force far from equilibrium.
Because as we established earlier, a comfortable, static organization is a dying organization.
Exactly. To operate effectively as a high-functioning, open dissipative structure, the enterprise must continually import high-grade energy and relentlessly, aggressively discard accumulated energy.
So if a specific process or a legacy product line or a whole department is acting as thermal mass, if it's just absorbing capital and calories without generating forward thrust, you shut it down immediately.
You must maintain the corporate system in a highly kinetic, slightly uncomfortable state. You have to continuously shatter your own market constraints before internal entropy initiates a total systemic collapse.
Which means if we pull back and look at the macro environment, The era of intuitive leadership and sociological alchemy is just over.
It's completely over. The market is way too fast. To survive the combinatorial explosions of new technology, the impedance mismatches of global supply chains.
The terminal queuing gridlocks of the digital market.
Right. The enterprise must submit to the absolute authority of organizational multiphysics. You must govern your company like an engineer governing a thermodynamic engine.
But that leaves us with a deeply provocative thought for you, the listener, to sort of mull over until next time.
Yeah, think about this.
We've established that the physical structure, the literal architecture of your organization, is strictly governed by the laws of thermodynamics. But what about the very vocabulary your executives use to govern it?
Think about the words spoken in your boardroom today.
Right. If your leadership team relies on infinite, unconstrained, physically impossible metaphors like synergy, alignment, bandwidth, or culture, are you mathematically guaranteeing operational blindness?
Can you ever fix a mechanical engine if you don't even have the words to describe its gears?
That lexical disconnect is the exact vulnerability that guarantees the failure of most transformation initiatives, and it is precisely what we will dismantle in the next stage of our analysis.
I can't wait for that one.
Join us for part 2. The lexical phase shift. Why metaphors fail. We are going to systematically eradicate soft language from the boardroom permanently and replace it with rigid, multi-physics equivalencies.
Until then, remember to subscribe to the Phronesis Research Group YouTube channel so you don't miss the rest of this definitive 8-part structural diagnostic.
Maintain your system integrity. So, in 2025, poor organizational communication burned up $9.6 trillion of global capital.
Right, yeah, 9.6 trillion.
Yeah, trillion with a T. And why? Because, humans basically cannot figure out how to talk to each other at work.
Which is wild when you think about it.
It really is. Yeah, keep your signal clear and your friction low.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the $9.6 trillion leak. We will see you next time for part 2.